Well, the only other thing to do would be to shut it back down and restart OBS. Okay. Well, we're going to try to keep going. No, I mean, you can look on your phone and see how it looks, but the audio is the problem. Well, the audio doesn't matter. We're going to try to keep going unless my technician up there tells me that we need to do more work. So if you're back with us, we're still in John 18. We're looking at the exchange between Pilate and Christ. They bring the leaders of the people bring Jesus to Pilate, and he said, "What'd this guy do?" And they say, "Well, he's a criminal." But that's all they got. So Pilate tells the Jewish leaders, "Well, then fine, take him and judge him by your law. I don't really care." And they say, "Oh, no, no, see, he has to be executed." And they didn't have a legal right under Roman rule to do executions on their own, although they did from time to time. For some reason, they really wanted to make an example out of Jesus, and so they wanted Pilate to have him crucified. So Pilate goes back in to see Jesus. Now, Pilate has heard about this man, Jesus. He's heard about the things that he's done and the miracles he's done. And of course, he knew about the triumphant entry and the fact that people were saying this was the King of Jews. And so when Pilate comes in and sees Jesus, he looks at this guy that's been up all night, that's been slapped around and beat around and is bound and whatnot. And he says, "You are the King of the Jews?" He's astounded by the man that he finds. Jesus asks him, "Why do you want to know?" And he's offended by that. He says, "Well, I'm not a Jew. I don't really care who the King of the Jews is." Jesus tells him a little bit about the kingdom of God. Just opens Pilate's mind a little bit to the concept that there is a kingdom that is not of this world. The only thing Pilate gets out of that is that Jesus must be a king, so he's got something to work with. Jesus tells him, "Listen, Pilate, what we really need to talk about here is the truth." And that's really particularly that particularly applies to this conversation that they're having, because what Pilate is supposed to be doing is getting down to the truth. This examination that he's having of the criminal is supposed to be an examination that allows him to know the truth. But of course, he doesn't care about the truth. Jesus says, "What we really need to talk about is the truth, Pilate." And Pilate just writes it off. "We're not going to get to the bottom of the truth. That's a concept bigger than you and I, King of the Jews." It's as though Pilate is saying. Very interesting for just a number of reasons. One thing that strikes me every time I read it is the fact that in the middle of all of this going on, Jesus stops and takes the time to have a conversation with a man about his eternal destiny. Jesus is concerned about Pilate's heart in this conversation. And Pilate had the opportunity to believe in Christ. Remember the purpose of the book of John. John says, a lot of people wrote a lot of other things about Christ. But I wrote these down so that you would believe. And by believing, you'll have life in His name. Everything in the book of John comes back down to belief or unbelief. And you won't see it anywhere quite as clearly as chapter 19, where there is a very clear division between the people who believe and the people who don't believe. And the funny thing is, the people who don't believe are the ones who've got it all figured out. They know what's going to happen next, and they've got it all put together. The people who do believe are confused and scared, but they don't stop believing, which is good, because then comes John chapter 20. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to show you this really cool thing right at the end of John 18 that helps us draw this picture, that gives us this division between the believer and the unbeliever. And it starts halfway through verse 38. After he, that's Pilate, had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no grounds for charging him," or literally, "I find no fault in him." So not only is he not guilty of any crime, the guy's just not guilty at all. Verse 39, "You have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Very, very interesting stuff going on there. You see, there was a man that had been arrested by the Romans that was scheduled to be crucified on this day. In his name, we call him Barabbas. That's kind of his last name. History tells us his first name, interestingly enough, his first name was what we would say Jesus. It was Yeshua. So his name was Yeshua Barabbas. Yeshua, which means Yahweh saves, and Barabbas, which means Son of the Father. So we have this man called Yeshua, the Son of the Father. And the thing that he was arrested for is really interesting. You see, what he was arrested for was claiming that he was some kind of Messiah. And that if people would just get on his side and follow him, well, then they would bring in the kingdom by overthrowing the Romans. And in the process of getting zealots to follow him, he became very militant and violent and killed some people and caused some issues. And so the Romans came and arrested him. There's this other man named Jesus who calls himself the Son of the Father with a capital S and a capital F. He said, I'm the Son of the Father. And he said, I am the Messiah, and I have come to usher in the kingdom of heaven. But rather than doing it through violence and force, he said, the real kingdom of heaven is not going to happen here on earth at this time. We're going to be bringing in peace, and we're going to be bringing in forgiveness, and we're going to be bringing in restoration instead of division. There's these two very clear, different figures between Jesus Barabbas and Jesus that we call the Christ. And the interesting thing is, Pilate knows why Jesus, who we call the Christ, has been brought to him by the leaders of the people. We're told he knows it's because John says they're envious. He knows it doesn't have anything to do with anything that Jesus has done. But he also knows that what they're charging Jesus, who is the Christ, with is insurrection and being a traitor, things that would get him crucified. The very things that Barabbas has been convicted of doing are the things they're charging Jesus of doing. And Pilate's a smart guy. He sees this parallel. And so he says, you have a custom, he says to the Jewish leaders, that I should release to you a person this time of year. Now, you need to understand this was like a really small local custom. It was like an agreement between Pilate and the leaders of the Jews that doesn't seem to have extended to other governors. It was just something that Pilate did with them at Passover. He said, we've got this custom that I release to you a prisoner. I've got two prisoners, both charged with insurrection. One has been convicted, and the other one we all know is not guilty. Which one would you like me to release? I'm sure he thought he had him backed into a corner at that point, because they're not going to want the man we call Barabbas. He was a troublemaker and a rabble-rouser, and he killed people. They're not going to want that guy running free. With that guy running free, they're going to lock all their doors tonight and not sleep as well. They're not going to want him. He's supposed to be crucified this day. Everybody has agreed that Barabbas is a bad dude. So he's got him. I've got this Jesus who's a bad guy or Jesus who's a good guy, and we all know the only reason you're charging Jesus the good guy is because you don't like him. So we got a guy you don't like or a guy who's going to kill you. Which one do you want? And much, I'm sure, to his shock and amazement, they say, give us Barabbas. So interesting to me that they are so blinded by their hate for Jesus that they just refuse to see the truth. And it's so interesting to me that they were willing to accept this guy Barabbas back into normal society, quite frankly, because he fit their narrative. They liked the idea of an independent Jewish state that's overthrowing the Roman government. They liked that idea. And Barabbas was promoting that idea, maybe incorrectly, but he was promoting that idea. And the other thing is, they felt like they could control Barabbas. They could go to Barabbas and say, this is the way we're going to get this done. They couldn't control Christ. So the one that they ultimately chose to release was the one that they felt like would fit their narrative and that they could control. The one that didn't fit their narrative and that they couldn't control, they wanted to just do away with him. And I see that so clearly in our culture today. We're going to see that come up a couple other times as we look through John chapter 19. How desperate these people are to be able to control the narrative to the point that they're willing to murder what they know is the truth so that they can accomplish what they want. It becomes particularly poignant when you read that last part of verse 40 there where John says, now Barabbas was a robber. Your translation might say a revolutionary or an insurrectionist. But what it literally says is he is a robber. John uses the same word there that he uses back in John chapter 9. Remember John chapter 9, there was a blind guy that Jesus healed. And this blind guy got in trouble because Jesus healed him. It didn't fit their narrative. Jesus is off doing good things for people, helping them see. Well, that's not okay with the Pharisees. He didn't ask their permission. They couldn't control him. He didn't do it in the way that they wanted it done. And so there's a little showdown between the leaders of the people and Jesus. Jesus said in chapter 9, verse 39, I came into this world. Am I in the right spot? I'm in the wrong spot. I want to go to a different spot. I want to go to John chapter 10. We could talk about that other one later. I want to go to John chapter 10, verse 1. See, that's what happens when I actually use my notes. I shouldn't do that. I should just do it out of memory. Anyway, Jesus says in the Good Shepherd discourse, where Jesus says, I am the sheep, the good shepherd. I watch over my sheep. I'm the door that protects my sheep. He says, truly I tell you, anyone who doesn't enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. It's the same word, a robber. Same word as Barabbas. Anybody who gets in any other way except through me, he says, I am the way, and anybody who goes any other way is a thief and a robber. Verse 8, he says it again. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep didn't listen to them. John says Barabbas was a robber. The same word. That he is trying to get in through improper ways. Later in the epistles that John writes, he makes up this idea, or he presents to us this idea of an antichrist. And just like today, people back in the first century were looking for the Antichrist. Who is the Antichrist? John said, you guys don't get it. He said, there's not the Antichrist, at least not in the context he's talking about here. He said there's many Antichrists. The idea is not a person that stands up that's against Christ, like we would use the term anti. You know, I'm anti-cockroaches, I'm against them. No, he says that's not it. Anti is more the concept of a substitute. He says it's not one person that's substituting as Christ, but there are a lot of substitute Christs, and you can read about that in 1st and 2nd John. He says there's people who are standing in the position of Christ, like Jesus Barabbas, who said, yeah, I'll be your leader, and I'll be your Messiah, and I'll bring in the kingdom of God in a substitute and counterfeit way. And Jesus says, Pilate says, which one do you want, the substitute counterfeit or the real deal? And they say, well, we want the substitute counterfeit because it fits our narrative. Jesus said back there in 9, where I started a little bit ago, some of the Pharisees who were with him heard him say these things, and they said, we aren't blind too, are we? Jesus says, if you were blind, you wouldn't have sin. But since you claim you see, your sin remains. They were so blinded by their hate for him and their desire to be in control that they were willing to accept a substitute even though they knew he was a harmful substitute. So Jesus Barabbas, who probably did a lot of the work to build Christ's cross, because in those days Roman prisoners built their own crosses, and Jesus was likely crucified on his cross, was set free, and Jesus was kept to be crucified. Chapter 19, starting with verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. You know, I spent a lot of time talking about flogging when we went through the Synoptics and explained to you what that was like. I don't think I'm going to spend that much time on the concept today. It's particularly brutal. I find it interesting that basically as soon as we hit John 19, the writer, John, becomes very matter-of-fact. He doesn't plug in a lot of details. He doesn't get intimate about anything. He just says, this is what happened. He says, he took Jesus and had him flogged. Later he's going to say, they handed him over and he was crucified. And I think part of the reason that John detaches so much and just tells us the facts is because John was the one of the 12 apostles that actually witnessed this. He actually saw this with his own eyes. He tells us later, I saw it. I was there. I saw the whole thing. And it was particularly brutal. And I'm sure even a number of years later, it was difficult to recount. And so he just gets through it as quick as he can. Another reason why I don't think that he broke it down is because the Christians of that day were well aware what flogging was. Some of them had received that. They were well aware what crucifixion was. They had all seen it. So when John says they took Jesus and had him flogged, the people who heard that immediately knew the horror of what he was talking about. The flogging here really had two purposes. When the Roman governor would sentence someone to flogging, there were a couple reasons for it. One was for punishment. That they could be, if flogging was for punishment, a person could literally be flogged to death. And it wouldn't take that many hits with the cat o' nine tails, the way that they had the system set up. It wouldn't take that many hits to kill a man with flogging. And it was a horrible way to die. The other reason that a Roman governor would sentence someone to flogging was to extract information. When they stripped somebody down and tied him onto that little post about 2.5 feet tall out of the ground, and the great big huge Roman soldier, the size of a big old linebacker, grabbed that cat o' nine tails, that leather whip with 9 ends that had glass and bone built into it to rip the flesh off of a man. Boy, if that person was withholding any information, they'd start singing like a canary. And if they didn't get the information out of them they wanted just by standing there with the cat o' nine tails in their hand, one whip with that thing, and you'd start learning all kinds of stuff. I'll tell you anything you want, just don't hit me again. And it's likely that that was the first thing on Pilate's mind when he went ahead and said, let's go ahead and flog Jesus, was because if there was anything that Jesus was withholding, anything that needed to be known, even though Pilate was convinced he was completely innocent, if there was anything that Jesus was withholding, he would say it during this flogging. So after being flogged, Pilate could come back to the Jews and say, listen, I have extracted information from him, and there's nothing. And that appears to be what Pilate's goal was. So Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Verse 2, the soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and clothed him in a purple robe. I think maybe the crown of thorns is probably one of the most interesting things in the whole deal. I imagine that the sequence of events was something like Pilate went in and spoke to the centurion in charge of the prisoners and said that this particular prisoner was to be flogged, and so the centurion assigned people to that task. Jesus was taken out and flogged, and then the centurion went back in and reported to Pilate, he's been flogged, we stopped after so ever many lashes, and no information was gained. During the time that the centurion is reporting to Pilate, the soldiers decide to have a little fun with Jesus. They don't like Jews. The Roman soldiers are tired of Jews. Being in Jerusalem for the Passover is probably the worst duty they could have. They are in a situation where they're supposed to be strong and powerful over the Jews, but they're limited by political rules and laws. Well, they finally have a Jew who has been claimed to be the king of the Jews, that they can do anything they want with. And they just come unglued. So they decide they're going to dress him up as a king. So they make a crown of thorns and put a purple robe on him and begin to slap him and abuse him and say horrific things to him. You can certainly read about that in the other Gospels as well. Interesting, I don't know if you guys ever read the Chronicles of Narnia. Remember the scene where Aslan the lion is being bound up and shaved because he's going to be killed by the bad lady. And the two little girls that are watching say, with the size and power of his paws, just one swipe and he could knock them all out. Why won't he do something? I see that same thing when I see this. When I see Jesus being flogged and then dressed like a clown king and slapped around and made fun of, he could stop it in a second, but he doesn't. Some of that, I think, is because of this crown of thorns. You might remember back in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve determine that they want to make their own way. They want to receive all that the world has for them, that they want to be wealthy and wise on their own. They want to eat from the best of the world, they've determined, in defiance against what God has offered. They feel like they can do a better job on their own than what God has given. And so they sin, and because of their sin, because of their rebellion against God, the natural consequence is death. So God comes and very mercifully doesn't kill them right away, but puts together this plan in Genesis chapter 3. Part of the plan is a level of consequences that they're going to have to deal with until they die physically. And to Adam, in chapter 3, verse 17, God said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you'll eat from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return." Verse 18, it will produce thorns and thistles for you. When you're trying to grow crops, what you're going to get are the worst possible kinds of weeds. Weeds that are extremely difficult to extract, and weeds that will cause you physical harm. Thorns and thistles. In Israel to this day, agriculturists, people who try to plant farms and vineyards and stuff, have to fight against thorn bushes. They're just a common problem. Like blackberry vines here are in northwest Washington. These thorn bushes just come in and take over. And they are some big, nasty thorns. Because of Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, and because of the experience that the Hebrew people had with dealing with thorns, these particular thorns, these one specific kind of thorn bush, really became a symbol for them of what sin was. Because of sin, they had thorns. It was something that they could grab onto, quite literally grab onto, that they could have a very physical representation of what sin was like. They ought to be able to just plant and grow food and everything great, but they have to continuously be fighting against these thorns that take over their fields, that are very harmful for them, that cause them harm to deal with. This ideology about the thorns is all through the Hebrew mindset. In Hebrews chapter 6, the writer of Hebrews is talking about the difference between people who receive the teaching of Christ and the people who refuse to receive the teaching of Christ. And he uses a little analogy, a little picture story for us in Hebrews 6, verse 7. He says, "Land that drinks the rain often falling on it, and that produces a crop useful for those for whom it's farmed, receives the blessing of God." And he's talking about receiving the Word of God and having it make fruit in your life, like John often talks about. And then he contrasts it in verse 8. "But a land that produces thorns and thistles is worthless and in danger of being cursed, and in the end it'll be burned." In other words, people who produce thorns and thistles, the evidence of sin in their life, boy, they're in danger. So much was this concept of thorns a part of the Hebrew mindset that in the parable of the sower, Jesus used that concept. Remember that parable? He goes. There's the farmer that goes out and he scatters seed in 4 different places. 4 different types of seed fall down. Some of it falls on the path and the birds come and eat it, and some of it falls in the rocks and it grows up and the sun comes and gets it. Some of it falls on good soil and it becomes mature, but some of it lands on the thorns. And now it grows up, but it never really makes it to maturity. Well, later, his disciples ask him, "Tell us about this parable." And he does. And he spends extra time talking about the thorns. He says, this is the deal. The seed that fell among the thorns and thistles. Well, he said, the thorns and thistles are the deceitfulness of wealth. The deceitfulness of wealth and the desire for things of this life. And what he's telling us there is people go about their lives and want to make their own lives so great that even though they've heard the gospel, they're investing so greatly in themselves that they can never grow to maturity. And there's this little bell ringing in the Hebrew mind, thorns and thistles. That's what happened to Adam. He was so interested in making his own life great, in investing in his own life, and in producing the things that he wanted to produce, that He died because of thorns and thistles. The thorns are absolutely the picture of everything that has happened to man since the moment he chose to sin. The thorns are the weight, the consequences for seeking after our own life apart from God. And that's what a very unwitting Roman soldier grabbed to make a crown for Christ. These thorns that were the symbol of the weight of sin. He was, in a very symbolic way, quite literally, carrying the weight of sin on His head to the Hebrews. They pushed that down onto His skull, breaking the skin, and you know how a head wound bleeds. With His blood running down His face, He was carrying the weight of sin. So very interesting. Verse 3, they kept coming up to Him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and were slapping Him in His face. They didn't care if He really was the king or not. They felt like they were in charge. Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing Him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging Him." He's saying, I have had Him flogged a step farther than I should have done. And I want you to see, I want you to witness the fact that that has happened to Him, and there's still nothing that I should be charging Him with. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man," or "Behold the man. Look at him. Beat up and made fun of and a real mess. You really think he's a threat to you?" Pilate is saying. However, when the chief priests, verse 6, and the temple servants saw Him, they were absolutely incensed. I wonder what they saw when they saw that crown of thorns and purple robe. First of all, they knew that the Roman soldiers were making fun of them. They weren't so much making fun of Christ as they were making fun of them. Here's your king. Look what we did to him. You ain't got much, do you? And so they want to distance themselves from that image as much as they can. But I wonder if they saw that, and I just wonder if some of them saw that and saw that picture. I can't imagine they wouldn't have caught that picture. The thorns on His head. He's carrying the thorns of sin on His head. So they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate responded, "Take Him and crucify Him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging Him." In other words, you do it. I'm not interested. Yeah, that's where we're at. Verse 7, "We have a law," the Jews replied to Him, "and according to that law, He needs to die because He made Himself to be the Son of God." Verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he was more than afraid than ever. I talked on Sunday about how Pilate was superstitious, how he, tried to have a connection with the spiritual world. And you got to understand the culture in which Pilate grew up in. You all have heard and learned about Greek mythology and how the Romans kind of adopted Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, it wasn't uncommon for a god to have children that walked on the planet. Whether or not Pilate believed that or not, it was part of his makeup. I mean, he grew up learning these things. It was part of his cultural identity and part of who he was. So the concept of someone being a son of a god was pretty scary, especially when we're talking about the Jewish God, when they claim that their God is the only God who is over all things and made all men and is in charge of all men, and this is the son of that God. Pilate was more afraid than ever. He is I mentioned earlier, such an interesting study. Pilate was known for his brutal decisiveness. Once he's made a decision, we're done. Can't do anything to change it. Pilate was also known for having a very hot temper and making very snap decisions. He's heard enough of the case. He doesn't need all the facts. He's heard enough decisions been made. Pilate was also never hesitant about killing people. I mean, if somebody was getting in his way, let's just kill him. It's all right. Just another Jew. It didn't really matter. Matter of fact, the thing that got him recalled to Rome was there was a small conflict with a whole bunch of Samaritans that really wasn't that big of a deal until Pilate decided to kill them all. But that's just the kind of guy he is. But when it came to Jesus, he was very afraid. We see 3 specific situations where Pilate comes to talk to Jesus. And the way that he comes and talks to Jesus, it's almost like he's saying, Jesus, help me out here, man. I'm trying to get you free. Help me out here. And of course, Jesus won't. And we see three very specific instances where he comes and talks to the Jewish leaders, where he says, you guys understand this man needs to go free, and just takes whatever they give him. Verse 9, he went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus didn't give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you? Kind of funny, I was thinking about that today. If he really felt like he had the authority to release him, he already would have. But nonetheless, Pilate is indicating to Jesus, I'm the one in charge here. Jesus answers, you would have no authority over me at all if it hadn't been given you from above. Jesus very clearly tells him, you are not the one in charge here. You know now that I'm the Son of God. You've heard that. Well, God's the one who gave you this authority, so I'm the one in charge here. And then he says, this is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. And we read in verse 12, from that moment on, Pilate kept trying to release him. Pilate realizes that what he's done already in having Jesus bound and flogged was sinful, that he has offended the Jewish God, and that if he keeps it up, he could be in really bad trouble, offending the Jewish God. Somebody's going to ask me about verse 11. This is why the one who handed you over to me is guilty of the greater sin. Wait a minute, there's greater sins and lesser sins? There's like a scale of sins. Some sins can be worse than others. And same with punishments, there's lesser and greater. And also same with rewards, there's lesser and greater. We're not talking about that today, so have fun looking that up. Verse 12. From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him, but the Jews shouted, this is just absolutely stinking hilarious. These guys, did you ever read a news article, maybe that popped up on Facebook or Yahoo News, and you're reading this news article, and it's so way off base. You think this has got to be satire. Somebody has got to be making this up. This is just, come on, this is nuts. It's almost hilarious how twisted it is. Well, that's what we're seeing right here. The Jews kept shouting, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. They don't care about Caesar. Not only that, who did they just demand to be released? A man who was opposing Caesar. A man who said, I'll be the Messiah and King, Yeshua Barabbas. I'll do it. I'll come get rid of that Roman king. That's the guy they just had released. If Pilate was truly concerned about being a friend of Caesar, and if they were truly concerned about that, then Barabbas would have been crucified for sure. But here they are trying to make a claim for themselves. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Now, what they've just done in code is told Pilate that if he lets Jesus go, they're going to write a letter to Caesar. And that was the thing Pilate was most afraid of continuously, was that somebody would tell on him. Pilate had already been told on a couple of times, nearly cost him his job before. He couldn't afford to be told on again. And what they just told him in code is, if you let Jesus go, we're going to write a letter saying that a man came who promoted himself as king of the Jews, and that we captured him and we delivered him to Pilate on your behalf, Caesar, so that Pilate could do away with this guy. But Pilate said, I don't care if he is the king of the Jews, I'm going to let him go. And so Pilate, he's a traitor. When Pilate heard these words, verse 13, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement. It was preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. That's extremely important. It's Friday at noon. The Passover is the biggest Sabbath of the year, and it's the next Saturday. Sabbath starts. In the Jewish mind, so I understand to us, the new day starts at midnight, right? On our calendar, we flip the calendar at midnight. But that's not the way our minds work. For us, the new day starts at sunrise. That's the way our minds work. You get up Monday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning and it's still dark out, and you're like, it's still the middle of the night. I'm going back to bed. You get up Monday morning at 6:30, the sun's up. Oh, it's Monday morning. I'm going back to bed. No, you get up and do whatever you got to do, but want to go back to bed. That's how our minds work. But in the Jewish mind, it was very different. In the Jewish mind, the new day started at sundown. So today ends at sundown. The new day starts at sun up. Or pardon me, at moon up, at sundown. As soon as it gets dark, the new day starts. So the new day started at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. That was particularly important for Sabbath because remember on a Sabbath day, there were all these rules of stuff you weren't supposed to do that they had. So they actually defined the moment of when the new day started. The new day started when the sun had gone down and you could see the moon and 3 stars. As long as you could see the moon in whatever phase it was and 3 stars, the new day had started. So it's Friday, it's noon. Tomorrow is Passover Sabbath. Very important. Okay, so he brought Jesus out at about noon, and he told the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, "Take him away, crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king?" Get this one. "We have no king but Caesar." The very two-faced chief priests said. So very interesting. So very interesting. The ones they hated the most, they were willing to ally with to get rid of Jesus. So interesting. And then Pilate, verse 16, hands him over to be crucified. I remember being in school, 5th, 6th grade, and hearing about peer pressure. I don't know if they still talk about that in school. But I know that became like the thing. During the whole Nancy Reagan Just Say No movement. I'm dating myself a little bit, but that was just peer pressure. Just say no. Do what you know is right. Not Pilate. He totally gave in to peer pressure. And not the Jewish leaders. They totally gave in. It's really interesting that Jesus came bringing a message that was different than anybody had ever heard before. A message of love and grace and forgiveness and reconciliation, and a message of God paying the cost himself. Tremendous mercy. And he came bringing a brand of truth that was undeniable. A solid kind of truth that nobody could pick on and nobody could put down. And his methods were very unconventional. The way that he did stuff was really interesting and unusual. And I think wildly successful. But the entire time he was doing it, he was being corrected. Remember, his brothers came to him a couple of times and said, "Jesus, the way you're doing this is all wrong. The things you're saying are wrong, and the way you're going about it is wrong, and you need to do it this other way." Even his own disciples at one point came to him and said, "Jesus, buddy, you got to change the message here because you're offending people." Many people told him he would have a much more successful and much more fruitful ministry if he would just engage in culture in a more relevant way. And he didn't. And of course, he was crucified for it. The difference is, Jesus is still remarkably effective today. I mean, he is still affecting our world on a minute-by-minute basis today. All around the world, everywhere you go, everyone has heard of Jesus and the things that he's doing and the church that we're seeing. There were a couple of people in the story who very much caved to the narrative, and one was Pilate. I mean, Pilate, like we were just talking about, he knew better, but he needed to engage with the Jewish people in a much more culturally relevant way. And then there's the Jewish leaders who found it very advantageous to engage with the Roman culture in a very culturally relevant way. And the Jewish leaders, well, we know what happened to them. AD 70, the whole city's gone. Pilate, we know what happened to him. He got recalled to Rome, and there's a few different traditions about how he spent the rest of his life, but none of them are pretty. I mean, the one guy who just said, "I'm just going to stand for the truth, and I'm just going to do things the way that I've been told to do things by Father in heaven," was remarkably successful, even though they crucified him. And the guys that said, we can make an easier way. We can engage with our culture and use our culture to advance our our dogma are gone. Interesting and poignant, and you can make your own application to that. I'm not going to make my own application because it's election season. Verse 16, then Pilate handed him over to be crucified. They took Jesus away, carrying the cross by himself. He went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is Golgotha. There is still, you can find this hill there in Jerusalem. It's pretty well known. It really does look like a skull. I've seen pictures of it and heard people talking about it. It's a well-known place. There is just right nearby, there is a garden. There's another spot that the Catholic Church venerated in the Middle Ages and said, well, this was the tomb that Christ was in, but it's kind of been recalled. And there's a garden tomb there that's just right down the hill from this place called Golgotha. And it's outside the city gates, and that's important because we know Jesus was buried outside of the city. And really, I don't think there's anybody at this point that is in disagreement about the fact that this is the garden tomb that they talk about, or that this is the hill that Jesus was crucified on. The interesting thing about the hill that Jesus was crucified on is another connection that's back in Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 22, Abraham is called by God to take his son Isaac, his only son whom he loves, and to sacrifice him in the place that I will show you, God said. And so he took a 3-day journey up to the north, kind of northeast, to a hill called Mount Moriah. And there he took Isaac up onto the hill and prepared an altar. Interestingly enough, he had Isaac carry the wood for the altar. Usually you didn't have the sacrifice carry the wood. He had Isaac carry the wood that he would be sacrificed on up to the top of Mount Moriah and bound him there and prepared to go through with sacrificing him to God when God said, Abraham, stop. He said, now I know that you'll follow me no matter what. And from that moment on, Abraham is known as a friend of God. I have a friend that I haven't talked to in quite a while. His name is Gerard. Gerard and I worked night crew at Safeway together. That's almost like working the trenches in World War II in France together. It might not have been quite that bad, but it was pretty close. And Gerard and I became really good buddies. Because when you go through something particularly strenuous and difficult with someone, when you share that experience with them, you become incredibly good friends. Lifelong friends are made in war zones. Well, there was one human to whom God could relate in that way, and that was Abraham. Abraham was the only other human, the only other individual, the only other person that's ever existed that was willing to sacrifice his own son for the plan of God. Abraham was, and God the Father was willing to sacrifice his own son for the plan of God. Abraham, his only son, Isaac, his only son who he loved, carrying the wood up onto the top of Mount Moriah. Now here's the interesting thing. Hebrew people, for about 3,500 years now, have held that Mount Moriah is what we today call Calvary or Golgotha. That hill there in Jerusalem that kind of, right outside Jerusalem, kind of overlooks a little part of the city. Well, that's Mount Moriah. It's right over there. I mean, we Christians, we call it Calvary or Golgotha, but to the Hebrews, that's Mount Moriah where Abraham offered his son. That's an amazing, hair-raising connection. That the very place that God allowed it to be pictured, here's what's going to happen a couple thousand years from now, Abraham, here's what's going to happen. Jesus, his one and only son whom he loved, whom he was willing to sacrifice, carried the wood himself up onto the top of the hill. And that's where we find him. Verse 18, there they crucified him with 2 others, one on either side with Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had a sign made and put on the cross. It said, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. I want to stop there just a second and put up a parenthesis. I have heard people say, the gospel accounts are in conflict. They're not telling the same story because the wording of the sign. Because all 4 accounts word the sign just a little bit differently. Luke says this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And Well, Matthew just says the King of the Jews, and so they're different. Well, listen, when it comes to classical documents, when you have multiple documents on the same subject and they're identical, we tend to discount them because that means either they're forgeries, or that means they were copies after the fact, or it was that the whole group of people who wrote it got together and said, let's make sure we have our story straight. When you've got classical historical documents that are talking about a historical event that that say the same thing in different ways, well, those ones we believe. So that actually, when somebody says, oh, they're in conflict, you can say, actually, that's part of how we know that they're accurate, that men saw that and wrote it down. It gets even more interesting when you see this. You know that Pilate had that written in 3 languages. He had it written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. It tells you that in verse 20. Many of the Jews read the sign because the place where Jesus crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Now listen, I know that a lot of translations say it was written in Aramaic. It actually in Greek says it was written in Hebrew, but you also need to understand that John the Apostle regularly traded those terms back and forth, Hebrew and Aramaic. But it becomes very interesting when you realize what those languages represent. Hebrew is known as the language of religion. Greek is known as the language of human philosophy and intellect. That's why if you do studies of philosophy in college, you have to know Greek to do it. And Latin, of course, is the study of politics and power and human law. So in all 3 of those situations, religion, intellect, and law, we're told that he's the King of the Jews being crucified there. And many people from all around the world would come and see these people who are being crucified. And on this day, Passover Friday, millions of Jews are seeing those who've been crucified, and they're seeing the one called the King of the Jews. And this was a huge slap in the face for the Jewish leaders that, they're saying that their king has been crucified. So they go to Pilate and say, don't say that. That's embarrassing. We want you to say, he said he's the King of the Jews. And Pilate, in one last moment of rebellion against them to show that he's stronger, he says, what I've written, I've written. I'm not going to change it. Deal with it. Just deal with it, he says to them, to show how cool he is. I'm going to deal with this next section on Sunday, so I'll just read it and mention a thing or two, and then maybe we'll get that last little part in before we run out of time. Verse 23, when the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, a part for each soldier. There were 5 parts to the clothes. I had to write them down because I always forget. I may not be able to find it now because I haven't been following my notes. Oh, hey, there we go. There were shoes. There was a belt or a sash. Sometimes it's called a girdle. There was the inner garment. Then there was the turban that he would wear on his head. And then there was an outer garment or a coat or a cloak. And the most valuable of the things was the outer garment. Sometimes it's called the robe. That was what a Jewish man in this time typically wore. There were 4 soldiers, 5 items, 1 part per soldier. One of them got the shoes, one of them got the belt, one of them got the inner garment, one of them got the turban. Remember, you couldn't just run down to the Gap and buy clothes in those days. Clothes were incredibly expensive. Cloth was incredibly expensive and labor intensive. So these were really valuable things. Now, they were all this man had. It was common that when a man was crucified, the Roman soldiers got whatever property he might have. The only property Jesus had was quite literally the clothes on his back. But that's what the Roman soldiers got. Each one of them took a part of it. But then they came to the tunic or the coat or the cloak or the robe, which was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. This was serious, fancy-dancy stuff. Somebody very wealthy. Matter of fact, Luke tells us there were some ladies that supported Christ's ministry out of their own pocket that were very wealthy. It's very likely that one of them had this made for him. It's very expensive, very fancy that he had. And it had some value. And it was considered artistic. I mean, this is all handmade stuff. So it was considered a beautiful artistic thing in addition to a coat. So they said to one another, let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who gets it. I mean, cloth was valuable enough that if it wouldn't have been so special, they would have just cut it up into 4 pieces. Each one got a piece, use it for patches, make something else out of it. But this one was just too nice. Let's not tear it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that says, they divided my clothes among themselves and cast lots for my clothing. And this is what the soldiers did. That's out of Psalm 22. If I had time, I'd read for you Psalm 22. I give you this homework. Read Psalm 22. It's called the Psalm of the Cross, and it's an absolutely fantastic story of Jesus on the cross that was written 1,000 years ahead of time. It's amazing. It'll give you chills to read Psalm 22. And then we'll do just this last section. Verse 25. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. His mother's sister might have been Salome, which might have been John's mom, which would have made them cousins. We're not sure. Mary the wife of Clopas. Clopas might be Cleopas, that Luke mentions. It was common to spell names different. Cleopas was the man on the road to Emmaus, so it might have been his mom. That'd be kind of cool. And, of course, we know Mary Magdalene. Verse 26, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he loved standing there, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then 27, he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into her home. The disciple we're talking about is John. Of course, that's how he identifies himself. So here's the situation. Jesus is the firstborn son of Mary. Joseph is gone. Joseph is dead at this point. Jesus is responsible for Mary. He is, by law, he is responsible to provide for her in her old age as her firstborn son. That's his job. Now, should he die, that's supposed to go to the secondborn son. The secondborn son becomes responsible for Mary. Where is the secondborn son? He is nowhere to be found. Jesus has this issue that needs to be settled. He hasn't had a chance to talk to his mom and say, "Oh yeah, by the way, tomorrow I'm going to get killed, so let's make a will and get this thing handled." He needs to legally settle the issue of his mother before he dies. So he legally settles the issue by saying, "John, you are now legally responsible for my mother." I find that fantastic, and there's a little sermon in there, and here's why. Having to be responsible for your mother in her old age was not a drag. It wasn't something you didn't want to do. It was a great honor. To be the one to provide for the elder, particularly your mother, was a tremendous honor. It was Jesus' right to do that. His brothers would have loved to have had the honor of providing for mom. But it was Jesus' right. And so Jesus did it up until this point. Jesus needed to hand that right off to someone. He handed it off to the youngest of his disciples, the least qualified, a man who had no job, well, a teenager really. He was probably not more than about 17 at this point. He had no job. He had no home. He had no place to take her except for his dad's house. I mean, of all of the people Jesus knew, John was probably the least qualified. If you look at the kind of qualifications we would look at. I mean, if I'm Jesus, I'm probably going to send her to Peter because Peter has a job, fishing business. He makes money. He's got a family. He's already taken care of his mother-in-law. The two ladies might have gotten along real well. I'd have probably picked Peter. Or if not Peter, I might have picked one of the other guys that has some wealth and resources and a home. Certainly we know Levi, that we call Matthew, that he had been wealthy. I might have picked one of the guys that had a little more qualification. Matter of fact, if I could have, I probably would have gone with one of the wealthier friends that I've got to make sure my mom is well taken care of. But Jesus picked John, the least qualified. I thought about that for a long time. Why in the world did he pick John? But the answer is really obvious. John was there. There was a Petra song years ago when Wendy and I were teenagers called "I Am Available." And the gist of the song is, I'm really not good at anything. I am not particularly special in any way. I don't have any particular talent that makes me something fantastic that maybe, God, you ought to take notice of. But I do have this. I'm available. So if there's something you need me to do, I'll do it. And that's what John had. He was available. He was there. It wasn't that he was overly qualified. It was just to receive this great honor. It was just that he was there and he was willing. You can almost see him reach out and take Mary's shoulder as Jesus calls out to them from the cross. I've got it. I'll do it. You can count on me, Jesus. No idea how he's going to get it done, but it says from that hour. So legally, from that moment, she was his charge. He took care of her. And I'll bet she did just fine. I'll bet he took real good care of her because he promised Jesus and he did it. And like I say, man, one day when I get a chance to talk to some teenagers at a camp, I'm going to tell them that story. He's not looking for your qualifications. He's just looking for people who are available, who are there, who are willing. And here's John standing in a very difficult place at the foot of the cross, willing to serve Jesus even at the worst possible moment. There wasn't anything else he could do. It wasn't like he could make the pain go away or get Jesus down off the cross and heal him. Quite frankly, Jesus was the only one who could do that, and he'd chosen not to. But he could stand there with Jesus, just be there with him. That was all he could do. Anything Jesus needed, he was ready. And there was just one thing, and it was a huge and great honor. So that's why I'm telling you this story tonight instead of somebody who could probably do it a whole lot better, is because one day when I was 14 years old, a guy said, "Hey, I think that God's calling some boys into the ministry. Are you one of them?" And I said, "Well, I can be. I'll do it." And so here we are. So I hate to leave Jesus hanging on the cross, but we're going to touch this again on Sunday and then sum this up next Wednesday. The beginning of John chapter 20 is probably my favorite spot in the entire Bible. I know I say that a lot, but no, I mean I really. That's probably the scene at the beginning of John chapter 20 is just fantastic. And we'll get to that next week as well. So let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for sharing with us your word. Lord, I pray that it worked online and that people were able to hear what you have to say and that you reached a lot of people with your love and your grace. And Lord, I pray that we would be available for you, whatever you call us to, just as John was. We thank you, Lord. Amen. Good night.